This is lecture 9 in POS 273 International Relations, an undergraduate online course taught at the University of Maine. I'm your instructor, Rob Glover. So today we're going to look at non-governmental organizations and the role that they play in international relations, but we expand the reach a little bit broader than simply non-governmental organizations. We'll actually talk about a range of non-state actors that play an important role in global governance. So first we have to ask, what is global civil society? That's a term that comes up quite a bit. You probably already encountered that in your book, so we'll talk about what that means exactly. And we'll talk about the role that non-governmental organizations or NGOs play in shaping global governance. We'll also talk about what other non-state actors shape and impact global politics, and kind of close with some thoughts about how the proliferation of non-state actors might be impacting the traditional state-based system, and ask whether sovereignty is being challenged, which is kind of an open question. So to start, there's this term global civil society. Now civil society, that terminology has a long history and has been used frequently. We use it quite a bit at the domestic level. When we're talking about individual societies, we'll refer to civil society. And there, basically, we're talking about any group or set of individuals who is participating in society in some organized way and is not part of the state, is not acting on behalf of the government, and is not acting on behalf of a corporation or an economic actor. Only recently have we been able to talk about global civil society. There have been instances of global civil society for quite some time, for at least 2 centuries, probably longer than that. But it's really kind of exploded in the last 20, 30 years or so, and we'll look at that a little bit when we talk about NGOs. But if we had to define global civil society, we would say individuals, groups, and networks operating beyond national borders, so beyond the domestic level, and generally not acting on behalf of a national government or for-profit economic actors. So we're not talking about representatives of the state, and we're not talking about corporations, businesses who may be acting beyond national borders, but they're not grouped within what we call global civil society. Now, as we said, global civil society has grown in the past few decades by leaps and bounds, really. And that's facilitated by some different factors. The first would be a global mindset. And when we say global mindset, we just mean a greater ability to link local impacts to global issues. In general, today, we have a greater sense of the way that our actions as individuals impact others throughout the world. Those connections, the networks that exist globally, even if they're not conscious, even if we're locked into economic networks and we have relationships of dependence and interdependence on other global actors, there have been a lot of ways in which those things have been made more clear to us. And in general, your average citizen has a greater sense that what I'm doing, even with mundane activities like buying a shirt at the store or filling up my car with a tank of gas, we have a greater sense of how that is embedded in a global network of interaction. So we can think about these local impacts and these local actions and connect them back to global issues. So there's this global mindset that is kind of drawing us in the direction of global civil society. There's also some very practical innovations and changes that have happened that enable global civil society. The expansion of technological means for collaboration and communication. This is obviously the internet is one thing that we're referring to, but it's not simply the internet. It's the ease of global telecommunications. It's the ease of shipping, the reduction in cost of shipping things globally, and also just kind of the ways in which simple technologies like telecommunications have become cheaper. 20 or 30 years ago, to make a phone call to Japan was an extremely, extremely costly endeavor that you had to think about very carefully whether or not you wanted to do it. And now with the advent of lower telecommunication costs, but also just the ease with which we can send email or connect via Skype, things like that. There's a greater possibility for collaboration and communication across greater distances. That has impacts. That has impacts for information that we're exposed to, stories and narratives that we're aware of, the expanse of global media networks, where now, it's not simply the case that we're getting kind of the news in our backyard, but the news in lots of different backyards throughout the world. And that goes alongside that global mindset as we're exposed to more events, more ideas, more things, just things that are happening throughout the world. We can have a greater foundation for global civil society and action in collaboration with others. Global capitalist development is an important part of this. A lot of these innovations came out of the market. They came out of businesses seeking new ways to do business and new ways to access foreign markets. And so all of the techniques for collaboration and communication that we take have commercial applications. And so that's important. It's important that the reason that a lot of these things were developed was to make money and to access foreign markets, and now individuals are figuring out other ways to use them to piggyback on those attempts to access new markets and access new areas, not simply to extract profit or to market goods, but to actually have genuine interactions with others. And then lastly, the gradual establishment of an international legal framework, which we went over in quite some detail last lecture, but that's important. For global civil society to exist as an organized entity, there has to be some sort of framework in which it's embedded, some rules and norms and expectations for how we interact with one another and what types of things we're trying to change at the global level. And so that international legal framework, which has grown and continues to grow, is kind of the institutional basis in which global civil society is embedded. So a number of different factors driving this rise in global civil society. One of the most important aspects of global civil society is the development of international non-governmental organizations. Now, a non-governmental organization refers to any group of people regularly interacting in some formal manner and engaging in cross-national collective action, provided their goals are non-governmental, they're not part of the state, non-commercial, they're not seeking to market products or to make a profit, and nonviolent. So we wouldn't say that Al-Qaeda or ISIS is an NGO. We generally accept the notion that NGOs are doing things through legal means, through advocacy, through direct service, but not engaging in violence. So we've always had NGOs at the state level, and now increasingly we're seeing NGOs at the international level. And so you'll sometimes see INGO, which is just referring to an international non-governmental organization. And the rise in INGOs is really, really striking. The chart in the upper left-hand corner of your screen is from a report that was done on INGOs actually in the early 2000s, so it's probably a little bit out of date at this point. But you see really, really kind of lower levels of INGO activity up until the 1980s. Now this is in thousands, right? So we see a low of 1956 in the year in which they started collecting information, a low of less than 500 or less than 5,000, sorry. And a peak with the last year that they had collected data in 1999 of over 25,000, somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 INGOs. And as I said, I wouldn't be surprised if it was significantly more than that now. And just because some of the changes, some of the developments that we mentioned in the last slide have continued to grow and continued to develop since that time. So lots of international NGO activity and a real kind of explosion of international NGOs in the last really, we've seen the explosion in the last about 25 years or so of non-governmental organizations operating across national borders. There's some examples here, which I imagine you're probably familiar with most of these. One of the oldest international NGOs that still has a really prominent role in international settings is the International Committee of the Red Cross, which has been in existence really since the mid-19th century. Some of these other NGOs are more recent, have developed in the last few decades, but all of them meet this definition for what we consider to be an NGO. So you see Greenpeace and Amnesty International, which is an INGO dealing with human rights issues, CARE International, which is an INGO dealing with development and public health. All of these organizations are pretty expansive in their scope. They operate across a lot of different countries, and they coordinate activity, not just for their own organizations, but they coordinate the activity of local movements or individuals, or have access to local governments within countries. So they serve in a lot of ways as kind of bridge spanners, boundary spanners between lots of different types of actors in the international realm. But they're good examples if you want to get a sense of, okay, what does an INGO look like? If you went to the website of any of these organizations and just read their about or mission statement, you'd get a sense of what this type of activity looks like. So what role do INGOs play in global governance? There's basically four kind of key roles that we could talk about, and INGOs are diverse. It's hard to say that any one INGO is typical of the various types of international non-governmental organizations that we'd see playing a role at the global level. So you really have to do your homework to get a sense of what specific INGOs are doing. If there's a particular group that you're interested in, you really have to kind of do your research to figure out what it is exactly they do. But these are four main functions that are very important in global governance. One is advocacy. So INGOs can advocate for specific global practices and policies at the international, national, and subnational level. So even though INGOs are international in scope, they exist beyond a specific country's borders, they'll still have operations at the international but also the national and subnational levels. And a lot of times this takes the form of advocacy. So Amnesty International, that was mentioned on the last page, is engaging in advocacy for respect of human rights and granting of human rights across lots of different settings. And sometimes they're petitioning something like the UN, but other times they're focused on specific national governments, and sometimes they're focused on specific problem areas within countries, and they're we're sending out action alerts to governors and local judicial officials because there's some issue or there's some political prisoner that they're particularly concerned about. But this broader role that they play, that INGOs play in global governance, is one of advocacy. They're lobbying for specific changes in the international system, or here is this international norm, it's very important that you respect it. Here is this convention that you've signed on to related to the environment or trade or human rights, and this is something that you need to follow, and here's some ways that maybe you're not following it. So they can push for specific practices to come into place, or they can try to hold different actors in global politics accountable for the things that they're doing. INGOs might also provide direct service. So many of the global health or development INGOs engage in direct service, where they're actually interacting with local populations that have some sort of need. Now that need can be tremendously varied, right? It could be education, right? There's an INGO that's working in an area to provide language training or basic primary education. It could be health. So you have an INGO that's gone into an area that's lacking in terms of its provision of public health or vaccination or dealing with some epidemic, some outbreak of disease or infection, and they're working to provide those services to populations that need them. Could be environmental in nature, right, where individuals are going in and training local populations to be in compliance with standards of environmental sustainability. Could be agricultural, it could be legal, it could be a whole host of different things. But the idea with direct service is that you're directly interacting with local populations and you're providing some sort of service or good that they need. Sometimes the actions of INGOs are more focused on research and monitoring. So for a long time, the key entities that collected information and data about things happening around the world, whether it be economic or environmental or political, a lot of those entities were linked with governments or intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations or the World Bank. And that is still the case. If you're looking for data and research on any aspect of international relations and global politics, usually those big intergovernmental organizations or even national governments are a good place to start. But increasingly, a lot of that data is being conducted by international non-governmental organizations. And sometimes these organizations have a lot of clout. So, for instance, one of the things that a country like the United States would be concerned with if they were going to give foreign aid to a country is the governance record of that country and whether or not they respect basic human rights. And so sometimes there's not good universal research for every country about the extent to which they respect human rights and are provide good governance at the national level. And so they will turn to think tanks that collect this type of information that can provide that sort of guidance in terms of distributing foreign aid. But a whole host of different things. There's lots of research entities and information and monitoring entities that are not governmental in nature. So they play that role in research, and that can also be really important in monitoring. If you've called upon a specific actor in international affairs or global politics to adhere to a certain standard and you want to ensure that they're doing so, an INGO can play that role. So you see this a lot with things like labor policy, right? That we don't want we don't want to get our goods manufactured in places that have lax labor standards and produced in sweatshops. So there are a variety of different INGOs that monitor labor practices at the national and local level. Those sorts of things, right, where the INGO is working with governments to ensure that certain standards are met and certain expectations which have been promised are monitored and adhered to. Then lastly, claims making. Now, sometimes it's the case that an individual or group who is in need of something or is suffering some injustice, they're just unable or prevented from making a rights claim upon the state. So if indigenous people are being deprived of land that they consider to be theirs in Latin America, and the one that's actually depriving them of their land is the state or a corporation that works hand in hand with the state, making a rights claim to that state might not be the most effective way of ensuring that they get what they want and what they deserve. In fact, in some cases that can be deadly. If you're in a country that doesn't necessarily respect human rights and the government is threatening your life and threatening your freedom, you don't necessarily want to march up to the government and say, you need to give this to us, we deserve these rights, you're treating us badly. And so they may be able to kind of circumvent the state if the state is the problem, if the national government is the problem. And INGOs can help groups and individuals make those claims at the international level. So this has happened frequently in a number of different cases where vulnerable populations bypass the national government and reach out to an INGO, and then the INGO works to engage in advocacy and claims on their behalf at the international level, even if it's just kind of a public appeal or making the media aware of something that's happening. Because of the way that these actors are able to circumvent their national governments and potentially have some sort of redress for whatever they're suffering, this is sometimes called the boomerang effect. Think of it like a boomerang, where it kind of goes in an arc and then comes back to you. The hope is that eventually these individuals making these claims see some sort of concrete progress, or their claims are addressed in some way, and the INGOs help to facilitate that. Right? So there's a variety of different roles that INGOs can play in global governance, and they're all very important. And as this sector has grown, we've seen more and more instances of INGOs taking on these roles. INGOs are also controversial, and they're controversial for reasons you might be able to imagine. Some of these roles can put them in direct conflict with sovereign states, almost by design, right? Particularly things like advocacy or claims making. They might be criticizing openly various sovereign state actors. Other times it's just kind of, there's problems with who actually has control and the mandate to perform certain actions within the areas, the countries where INGOs are operating. So I'm going to show you two quick clips that give you a sense of some of the ways in which INGOs sometimes come into conflict with the state, and the ways in which they're also sometimes not very warmly received by the people that they're supposed to be helping or serving in the countries in which they operate. So this first one relates more to state sovereignty. We'll watch it and talk a little bit, and then the second one relates to that, local populations and some of their critiques of INGOs. So I'll play this quick clip, and then we'll come back and talk about it a little bit.
The Indian government decided to cancel the licenses of nearly 9,000 charity organizations on Tuesday. Organizations receiving foreign funding were the main target for this decision. The government wants NGOs to declare details of their foreign donations. The first NGOs to face the consequences of the decision were Greenpeace India and the US-based Ford Foundation. The government canceled Greenpeace's license and put the Ford Foundation on a security watch list. Other NGOs are also having to face closure. According to the government's declaration, the NGOs were ordered to file mandatory annual returns, and those that did not comply would not find a place in India. Indian officials believe that foreign-funded organizations have ulterior motives to purely working for the good of India. They believe Greenpeace and other foreign-funded organizations are damaging the Indian economy. According to the Indian Intelligence Services, activities by the NGOs such as protesting power projects, mining deals, and genetically modified food programs are hurting the economic development. Greenpeace rejects these accusations, but this rejection has not affected the government's decision to cancel its license. The suspension of the Ford Foundation's accounts is also connected with their actions in India. Government officials believe that the organization is funding local activist groups. The government's decision has brought the attention of critics. Opponents to the canceling of the licenses of the NGOs think that it is a move to suppress criticism of Prime Minister Modi and his economic program. The US government has expressed concerns following the government's decision. According to US officials, the cancellation may harm democracy in India. Countries such as Uzbekistan, China, Russia, Egypt, and Venezuela also restrict the activities of foreign-funded NGOs. The Uzbek government has banned many NGOs after accusing them of plotting an uprising within the Uzbek community. NGOs in China also have to face with similar issues where organizations have started to work under the country's Public Security Bureau, which makes it more difficult for them to operate independently. Russian President Vladimir Putin also restricts the active NGOs in his country. He claims that foreign-funded organizations were the reason for the unrest in Ukraine and the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych last year. Egypt and Venezuela are also putting pressure on NGOs by passing laws restricting their areas of action. These countries view civil unrest as being caused by the actions of NGOs in their countries.
Okay, now the way to think about this, obviously it's a very quick presentation of ways in which NGOs have come into conflict with the national governments of the countries in which they're operating. But the way to think about this really is pushback from those national governments related to state sovereignty. The countries in which the NGOs are working that they cited, probably with the exception of India, are not really recognized as having the best record for democracy, free speech, and human rights. They mentioned Uzbekistan, Venezuela, Egypt, Russia, right? These are countries that if you went there, you simply wouldn't enjoy the same freedoms that you have in the United States or Western Europe. And many of these INGOs are Western European or North American in origin, right? So they go into these countries and they want to address local issues, they want to empower local actors, and sometimes that puts them in very confrontational situations with those national governments who are saying, look, this is our prerogative. This is state sovereignty. In India, we're trying to craft economic policy, and we have all of these INGOs who come in, and in some respects they're very helpful, but they can also get in the way. And particularly where you see kind of flashpoints of conflict are areas in which they're supporting tacitly or overtly local activism. And that was happening in several of these cases where there's some grievance and they're kind of directing it towards the government. Sometimes too this is just propaganda. Sometimes the local governments are looking for scapegoats to blame for things that are going wrong in their domestic political systems or their domestic economies, and to have these groups that are from outside and trying to play an active role in the societies, it can make them easy scapegoats, and sometimes they're targeted unfairly. But the key thing to recognize here is that this is really kind of a struggle for power and a struggle for control, and that can put INGOs into conflict with the national governments of the countries in which they're operating. And in fact, there are some countries where the stability of the country and the ways in which INGOs are targeted is so severe that INGOs won't even operate there. They won't go there because it's not safe for their workers and the people that they're interacting with locally. So there are some situations throughout the world in which INGOs kind of won't touch a specific country because it's simply too volatile. The next clip is an example of the ways that INGOs can come into conflict with local NGOs, local, what we call grassroots development. When we say grassroots, we mean, in general, something that's kind of rising from the bottom up, local control. It's not linked to the state. It's not linked to business, but this is citizens groups coming together in a specific country to address some sort of localized issue or local problem. And one of the critiques there is that INGOs sometimes can crowd out those local NGOs trying to address an issue. And so you'll have a big international NGO come in, and then all of a sudden the localized grassroots NGOs trying to address the same issue get crowded out in terms of funding or their degree of autonomy and control over a certain issue within a country. So this is a news clip, just a brief news clip from Kenya with some local activists and NGO workers talking about that trend. So again, we'll just watch this clip really quickly and then I'll come back and talk about it a little bit.
The emergence and consistent growth of international NGOs in Kenya is putting local non-governmental organizations on the path downwards. The international entities are being blamed by their local counterparts for lack of support from the government and donors, especially on funding. The council, which is moving around the country mobilizing all its members in a drive to vet all local NGOs, says that many of the local NGOs are now unable to carry out their duties.
They are actually supposed to be principal recipients, build the capacity of local NGOs with the National Council of NGOs. Then the local NGOs, who knows where the shoe pinches, is the one who is supposed to implement an activity.
She asked the international NGOs, the government and donors to build the capacity of local NGOs with the help of the National Council of NGOs. The council is also asking their donors, partners and government to have a meeting to discuss the matter. Masi Juma, NTV.
Okay, again, here's another instance in which we see the operations of INGOs within countries, and they're coming into conflict. But this time it's not the government, it's actually the local NGOs. In Kenya, the situation was that you had lots of international non-governmental organizations coming in, and that resulted in funds and capacity kind of being siphoned off from those local NGOs. And that can generate frustration with the local NGOs because they view themselves as the rightful entities that should be dealing with these localized problems. They have the localized knowledge, they understand the culture, they speak the language, and they feel that they know how to address some of these issues, be it health or security or education or whatever it might be. And then these large international NGOs will come in with the promise that they're there to build capacity, right? What INGOs will often say that they're there to do is empower local actors to address problems in their backyard. But this is clearly an instance in which the local NGOs didn't feel that that was the case. They didn't feel that they were being empowered. They didn't feel like their capacity was being built. They felt like their capacity was being taken away. And funds and roles in addressing these issues that would have been theirs were kind of siphoned off by the international NGOs. This is a pretty common problem. If you go to countries and get someone who's willing to be honest with you about the role of NGOs in their country, particularly in the developing world, they'll say that, yeah, these INGOs come in and they don't really understand the issue, and a lot of times they may have good intentions, but they don't actually end up helping the people in need. So another thing to be aware of, I want you to be aware that there are lots of critiques of international NGOs. For a long time, we kind of talked about NGOs as if they were this cure-all for lots of the problems that we face internationally. But there are critiques that come from above, and there are critiques that come from below. These are four of the main critiques of international NGOs that you should be aware of. The first is that INGOs may threaten state sovereignty. And state sovereignty, as we said, it's one of those constitutional principles of international relations and international law. And by INGOs coming in and attempting to address issues that had traditionally been addressed by the state, many states say that this siphons off resources that would have been directed at the state. So foreign aid, for example, that would have gone to the state is now being given instead to international NGOs. And it really constitutes this breach into their authority as the state. The state is the recognized entity that's supposed to be dealing with issues that face its population, but now you have these competing actors. So you do face those critiques from above in which states are saying INGOs are actually impinging upon our sovereignty. The second critique that you saw in the last clip is that INGOs can undermine the development of grassroots civil society in the countries where they operate. So in Kenya, you had an instance in which there were already lots of developed NGOs operating within the society, and then there was this influx of INGOs, and that was having impacts on the ability of these NGOs to operate. But in countries where there maybe isn't a robust civil society and there aren't lots of NGOs, the fear is that if you have lots of INGOs come in, maybe that civil society never develops, right? So either this is kind of taking away the robustness of the civil society that exists, or it's just preventing civil society from forming in countries where it's not really there yet. Critique that probably comes from both above and below is that INGOs often lack localized knowledge in the countries where they operate. So they may have a very good sense of the global scope of an issue, but tackling an issue at the local level often requires a very specialized knowledge about what is happening within countries and even within specific regions and areas within these countries. And INGOs might not have that, and they might not be open to receive that knowledge and gain that expertise from locals. There's also a critique of this tendency to what's called problem hopping, right? So an INGO that deals with global public health, for instance, they're dependent upon usually the donations of private funders and philanthropic organizations. And so they have to be constantly kind of pitching to these individuals and organizations the issues that they're working on in a way that conveys urgency, right? And so a global public health INGO might be working on, Ebola in West Africa, and then malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, and then women's reproductive health in another area. And it's just constantly moving from society to society to society, trying to address these issues in a very compressed time frame and trying to generate results that they can bring back to donors and say, look at this great work that we're doing. But that can work against the development of long-term expertise and knowledge. And some of these issues that they're trying to address are incredibly complex and require that sort of knowledge. So this tendency to problem hop can actually undermine their effectiveness. And then lastly, many INGOs have pretty bloated administrative structures. They're kind of top-heavy. They have a lot of people in suits that work in big cities and coordinate their activities globally. And some of those people are pretty well known, and some of those people are pretty highly paid. The director of the International Committee for the International Committee of the Red Cross makes about $7 million a year, and that from the perspective of local populations that are seeing the ways in which these INGOs interact with their problems on the ground can generate frustration, it can generate resentment. And just in practical terms, if you're devoting those sorts of resources to administrative salaries, to fancy offices in big cities, then you might not be able to devote the same level of resources to the problems on the ground. In fact, you just won't. If a big portion of your budget is going to administrative costs and overhead, right, then you're not devoting the same degree of resources that maybe a local NGO could devote. So those critical of INGOs will say that those resources actually aren't being targeted as effectively as they could be. So there's lots of critiques of INGOs that I just want you to be aware of, because I don't want you to have this kind of Pollyanna vision that there's all these great INGOs hopping around the world solving all of the world's problems. There are lots of great INGOs doing really, really important work, and lots of very committed people working in those organizations, but they are not always received with open arms. And this is the type of these are the types of biases or kind of stereotypes that they might encounter as they try to do their work locally, as they have to work against some of these conceptions of how INGOs operate and the ways in which INGOs might take away capacity from the local government and localized actors in civil society at the national level. So lots of critiques of INGOs. I want you to be aware of them. Now, there are lots of other non-state actors. We talk a lot about INGOs mainly because of just the way in which they have exploded over the past few decades and some of the really tangible impacts that they've had on international relations. But there are lots of other non-state actors that we wouldn't classify as NGOs, but they can have a pretty substantial impact on global politics and global governance. So we'll talk about celebrities and kind of celebrity advocacy, foundations and think tanks, multinational corporations, and then the other side of non-state actors is criminal and terrorist networks, which utilize the same technology and operate oftentimes in the same way, but they're not doing so for these altruistic, broader goals, the good of humanity. They're doing so for very narrow, sometimes dangerous objectives internationally. So we're just going to talk about these briefly, but I want you to be aware of kind of the range of non-state actors. Celebrity advocacy is important. It can kind of act as a multiplier for some of the advocacy that's happening by INGOs or the advocacy that local populations are engaged in. Here you have instances of various forms of celebrity advocacy. I'll just run through them quickly and give you a sense of who these different celebrities are. You probably know them from sight, and the different international actions and movements that they were or they currently are involved in. At your top left is Princess Diana. I know Princess Diana died several years ago, but she actually gained a lot of respect and was renowned internationally for her work on anti-personnel landmines. There was an international movement to attempt to create a convention banning the use of anti-personnel landmines. The issue with anti-personnel landmines being that after conflict is over, anti-personnel landmines stay in the ground and can actually make entire sections of countries pretty much inoperable. You can't use them for agriculture. It's not safe to settle in those areas. And the people who do live in those areas oftentimes encounter those mines, which are still active. And so you have lots of instances of, children or people living in communities accidentally stepping upon or stumbling upon a landmine and then losing a leg, and all of a sudden being unable to provide for themselves, and they can't work, or they die, right? And so Princess Diana was part of a much broader international movement to ban the use of anti-personnel landmines, and it resulted in an international convention in which over 120 countries, I believe, signed on to not using anti-personnel landmines. So her role was really important. This was kind of a humanitarian role, and she was able to push this issue, just given her prominence as an individual, she was able to push this issue into the international arena in a way that without that celebrity kind of power that she has, it might not have achieved the resonance, and we might never have seen that international convention. So this actually resulted in a piece of international law, and in large part due to celebrity advocacy. Now Bono, I'm sure you've been exposed to at some point or another, talking about various issues, right? The band U2 has always been extremely political, and Bono, starting in the 1990s, really kind of started to advocate for some of the issues facing sub-Saharan Africa and some of the least developed countries in Africa. The big one for Bono was debt. A lot of these countries are in extreme amounts of debt, and there was a movement in the 1990s for renegotiation of some of this debt. These countries that have extremely high levels of debt to international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. Can they renegotiate their debts because the development situation is such that they can't really make those payments, and it's detracting from really crucial public health issues and education issues within those countries. And so he became part of this broader movement to drop the debt, in which he was saying that some of the poorest countries in the world had corrupt governments which racked up huge amounts of debt. The people of those countries who were being brutalized by dictators never saw the benefits of foreign aid or assistance or development loans. Those just went into the bank accounts of corrupt government officials. And can we do something to address this issue of debt? Because it's blocking efforts at development in those countries and having real impacts on human health and education and economic development. So that's an issue that's kind of ongoing, and that's a debate that periodically comes up. But Bono was one of the individuals to push this into the international limelight, and was giving public talks with like Pope John Paul II and various groups on this issue, really kind of pushing it into the limelight. On the bottom, you have from left to right George Clooney. This is George Clooney being arrested outside the Sudanese embassy. He was protesting human rights abuses by the Sudanese government. In the middle is Angelina Jolie. Angelina Jolie was made special envoy of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We looked at the organizational structure of the UN. One of the social and economic organizations of the UN is the High Commissioner for Refugees. And she had done so much work and advocacy on this issue, and she was so passionate about it that the UN High Commissioner recognized that she could, play this really important role in bringing the issue of refugees to greater attention, and so he made her a special envoy. Lastly is Ben Affleck. In this instance, Ben Affleck was testifying before, I believe, a subcommittee of Congress about the conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Right. So in those three instances, you have individuals who have some degree of prominence, and the media is going to follow what they do, and they're attempting to use that prominence, attempting to use that status to bring attention to an issue and to create some sort of broader movement to address whatever that specific issue might be, right? The human rights abuses in Sudan, the plight of refugees, the plight of individuals living in war-torn Democratic Republic of Congo. So celebrities can play an important role, and if they can galvanize a movement behind them, celebrities in and of themselves can't bring about global change, but if they can create enough awareness of an issue and they can get the international community to act, then you can see actual tangible results. Probably the best example being the International Convention to ban anti-personnel landmines, which is a tangible achievement and now is a piece of international law, spearheaded by efforts of people like Princess Diana and others that tried to insert this issue into the global conversation. So celebrities can have an impact. The next kind of group that we'll talk about is foundations and think tanks. Much of the funding for international NGOs and a lot of the development work that occurs in various areas, development and health and education and some of these complex issues that we face throughout the world, a lot of it comes from private philanthropic organizations. So I have just 3 organizations here on your left-hand side. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, obviously this is Bill Gates of Microsoft fame, one of the richest men in the world, has started to think about how he's going to use that money and has started to direct millions and millions of dollars to initiatives in the domestic level, initiatives within the United States, but also initiatives at the global level. And so Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they fund a lot of work related to public health and education. And that's significant. I mean, we're not talking about small amounts of money. We're not talking about a small-scale organization. They are providing funding and donations to organizations working on various issues throughout the world that rivals the foreign aid provided by states. So they are actually a really major player on certain issues that occur globally. The Clinton Foundation, slightly more focused mandate. The Clinton Foundation is launched by the Clintons, Bill and Hillary Clinton, and it deals more narrowly with global public health. They fund a lot of work collaborating with NGOs and groups on the ground dealing with global public health. And so any organization that has millions to devote to an issue and alongside that has these prominent individuals like the Clintons or like Bill Gates behind it can really play an important role in shaping the conversation and shaping how these issues are framed internationally. The Carter Center is a little bit different. The Carter Center is linked to former President Jimmy Carter, who served one term as president and then has had probably a more successful career as just a public representative of the United States dealing with global issues. The Carter Center's mandate is more related to good governance and elections, free and fair elections. And so one of the things that the Carter Center does is they offer to oversee elections in countries that might not have the best record in terms of free and fair elections. If they've had past elections in which the results are disputed or there's allegations of fraud and, they want to bring in objective, non-biased outsiders to a country wants to bring in those outsiders to oversee an election and to verify that the process was free and fair and there wasn't tampering with the votes and there wasn't intimidation, encouraging people to vote in a certain way, then a country can reach out to the Carter Center and they'll provide that expertise and provide that presence on the ground to oversee their elections. So again, another organization that plays a really important role, especially as more and more countries have to demonstrate that they have a legitimate government and they've had free and fair elections for access to things like foreign aid. Increasingly, your access to foreign aid is being tied to having a legitimate government, and the Carter Center is an organization that can certify that legitimacy. There's also, at kind of the same time in which INGOs have been exploding, there's been an explosion in think tanks. Think tanks are, we've talked about them before in this class, but they're organizations that provide research, provide analysis, host forums, put out publications, put out reports on specific issues. And this is a list of the top 25 global think tanks. All of these organizations deal with a range of different issues, and many of them also have, they're not just doing research, they're also doing advocacy, they're doing other forms of activity that we would associate with INGOs. So like Amnesty International appears on this list, just based out of the United Kingdom, and they do quite a bit of advocacy work, but they also do a lot of research and produce a lot of reports. But there's a whole range of think tanks, and they play a really important role in shaping public opinion and providing access to research and data for things that are happening throughout the world. And there's a full list of the top think tanks worldwide, and a discussion of the role that think tanks are playing in international relations, and then it has think tanks broken up by region. At the link here, it's a report that was produced out of the University of Pennsylvania. But these organizations are important, not only in shaping public opinion and shaping the opinion of policymakers, but also just in terms of access to good research so that we can know what types of policies and what types of strategies will work to address really difficult issues like economic development or addressing public health or stopping civil war. So these organizations have grown in the same way that we've seen INGOs grow and play an increasingly important role in international affairs. Multinational corporations. Now, these are just two clips to give you a sense of the sheer size of some of the major multinational corporations. Walmart is bigger than Norway, and ExxonMobil is bigger than Thailand. And what they mean by that is if we simply measure the revenue of these corporations alongside the gross domestic product of these different countries, then they actually are bigger. If we were to consider Walmart not as a corporation but as a national economy, it would be the world's 25th biggest country if we simply looked at the money. And similar numbers with ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil would rank as the world's 30th biggest country if we simply looked at the numbers. We simply looked at economic output and wealth. Now, it is the case in the United States that wealth translates pretty easily into power to shape opinion and power to influence political decision making, and that is not a phenomenon that is limited to the United States. That is the case globally. So Walmart, by virtue of how much money it has, the number of operations it has throughout the world, and the way that it utilizes that money and that presence in so many different places, has the ability to shape outcomes. It has the ability to shape political decision making. They can dictate terms to countries in which they're going to do business in ways that smaller economic enterprises and even some countries can't. So in that sense, these multinational corporations, simply because of how big they are and the degree of wealth that they have, can have a really important role in saying, what labor policy is going to be, what environmental policy is going to be, and they can use that wealth. They can try to leverage that wealth to see certain outcomes. I don't think that's surprising. This happens within the United States. That money can be used strategically to influence the political process, but it happens in the broader global sphere as well, right? Where these corporations can utilize that money to actually impact outcomes. They don't always get what they want. They are sometimes told to go away. Corporations don't completely run the world, but they have an influence and they have a say, and they can impact what outcomes we see in international affairs. So they're another important actor. They're not the state. It's not an NGO. They operate on the basis of profit, right? But they can impact the way that things look internationally. Lastly, what's really interesting and kind of scary is that the same developments that gave rise to all of these NGOs or all of these think tanks or the power of the modern multinational corporation, they have been utilized, they have been appropriated by violent non-state actors, either criminal networks, organized crime, human trafficking, drug trafficking, or terrorist groups. Groups that have a specific objective to achieve and they're willing to use violence in order to achieve it pretty indiscriminately. So these trends that have given rise to NGOs and all sorts of other actors in international relations are also giving rise to a new kind of more nimble, more complex brand of extremism. We've always had extremism, and there have always been terrorist groups that are willing to use violence to achieve their single-minded political set of objectives, but they're utilizing the new technologies and new methods in order to do so. So there's a couple things that I just present to you quickly here to give you a sense of some of the ways in which this plays out. One of the major threats right now in terms of international security is ISIS. And the thing that's particularly striking about ISIS, and there's been some coverage of this in the news, and some of it is kind of alarmist and some of it isn't, but the ability of ISIS to recruit internationally. Right, you see this map on the left here is shows the countries from which citizens or residents have reportedly gone to fight in the Middle East on behalf of ISIS, and it's a pretty global reach. There's bigger numbers in the region itself. You have 2,500 people from Saudi Arabia and a little over 2,000 from Jordan, but their reach extends far beyond that, to the point where you have over 100 individuals from the United States have gone to fight for ISIS, and 26 people from Ireland, and 100 people from China, and 250 people from Australia. So there's something about their global reach in which they're able to, one, access these individuals somehow, and actually kind of radicalize them and get them to give up their lives, as they exist, give up their jobs and their home and their place within these other countries, and travel to the Middle East to fight on behalf of an organization that's a little bit scary, more than a little bit. It's downright terrifying. It has a incredibly extremist agenda and some really barbaric and terrible ways of pursuing that agenda. And the tools that they're using are the same tools that we're using to market our goods in far-flung places or to communicate with people around the world. They're using social media. They're using this network that has been built up around global capitalism to achieve their objectives in terms of the region and also their designs for what the Middle East should look like. So the key thing to note is that there's no development in international relations that is purely kind of positive, right? This is the other side of the coin. If you have these technologies, you have these trends in globalization and international relations, people are going to find ways to use them, not only, to spur economic growth or to target injustices, but to create new injustices and to spark violence and to spark hatred. And part of the strategy of not only ISIS, but Al-Qaeda and many of the radical extremist groups we see throughout the world has been a very systematic and sometimes very effective use of social media. So on your right-hand side, you have Inspire. And Inspire is the English language publication of Al-Qaeda. Specifically targeted at individuals in the English-speaking world, trying to either, propagandize on behalf of Al-Qaeda, or in some instances provide blueprints for domestic attacks that would occur, to radicalize people who might be kind of, feeling frustrated with the country in which they live and potentially susceptible to this radical ideology. And that's something that really started with Al-Qaeda and has become even more pronounced with ISIS, who has a very slick, very well-produced, very effective social media presence and campaign, and produces, videos that are their production value is just really, really striking. It's definitely something that they're doing consciously. So again, these trends of globalization that have put the power to communicate in the hands of more people and the power to communicate across greater distances also can be used to convey things that are fundamentally threatening and kind of unsettling. So just keep that in mind, that these tools, it's a double-edged sword, and these tools can be used for negative things as well. Okay, so we're going to wrap up there. Hopefully that gave you kind of a quick sense of some of the ways in which state sovereignty is being challenged because of these trends. All of these instances are empowering actors other than the state, and sometimes that draws these actors into very open conflict with the existing state authorities. They're uncomfortable with ceding this degree of authority, but that's something to think about for this week's discussion post. Is the power of the state kind of eroding? Are there changes happening that are forcing the state to kind of step back or to reassert itself, to redefine its relevance in relation to some of these other non-state actors? And will that continue? Will that continue to be the case, and will the power of the state continue to kind of decrease? It's an open question, and there's endless debates over whether or not that's the case. Obviously, some groups like the realists, who are very state-centric, are going to argue that that's not the case, and others like liberals and constructivists would say, yes, that's totally the case, and that's why realism is an imperfect framework to view international relations. But I'd certainly be interested to see what you guys think about this question. A couple reminders for next time. The first is that your final exam is Friday the 24th, and if you haven't done so already, there is a pretty detailed study guide that's available for you to check out. Also remember that your short weekly discussion post should be up by Saturday evening. And then you do have, it's kind of a busy week, you do have one more assignment that's due on Sunday in the assignment Dropbox in the appropriate folder, your pre-negotiation planning report. So this is the next step in getting you ready for the ICON simulation. You've been assigned your country, and it's asking you to kind of collect some information and talk a little bit about what your interests are and what your strategy are for the ICON simulation. So make sure to do that. Any of these things that you have questions about, feel free to contact me. I can provide guidance. I can answer your questions. I'm happy to help in any way. And next week, we'll be talking about international security. So some of the things that we just talked about, we'll be discussing in more detail. Read the chapter on international security in your book, the Lamy text. It's chapter 6. And as you read it, think about, how do you define security? One of the things that we delve into is it's just not super clear what security means. What do you think are the biggest threats to global security today? And is the international community doing enough to confront these threats? Also think about your own country. Think about the foreign policy of the United States. Do you feel like the United States has a handle on the threats that exist and is kind of proactively confronting them? Or are we struggling to catch up? Are we facing a new security world in which a lot of what we're doing is not proactive but reactive? It's kind of, again, an open question, and it's one of the debates that emerges quite a bit in any discussion of foreign policy. So I'd be interested to see what you guys think. Okay, so we'll wrap up there, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks.